Welcome to Astounding Stories of Space and Time. I'm Mardell, and here is the final part of Gone Fishing by James Schmitz. The end of year one. Barney Chard came up out of an uneasy sleep to the sudden, sharp awareness that something was wrong. For some seconds he lay staring about the unlit cabin, mouth dry, heart hammering with apprehension. Then he discovered it was only that he had left the exit door open and the window switched on. Only this was the first time since they had left him here that he had gone to sleep without sealing the cabin first, even when blind drunk, really embalmed. He thought of climbing out of bed and taking care of it now, but decided to let the thing ride. After all, he knew there was nothing in the valley. Nothing. In fact, on this world, of which he had a realistic reason to be afraid. And he felt dead tired, weak and sick. Feeling like that no longer alarmed him as it had done at first. It was a simple physical fact. The sheet under him was wet with sweat, though it was no more than comfortably warm in the room. The cabin never became more than comfortably warm. Barney lay back again, trying to figure out how it had happened he had forgotten about the window and the door. It had been night for quite a while when he went to sleep, but regardless of how long he'd slept, it was going to go on being night a good deal longer. The last time he had bothered to check, which Barney decided on reflection might be several months ago now, the sunless period had continued for better than 56 hours. Not long before dropping on the bed, he was standing in front of the big clock, while the minute hand on the hour dial slid up to the point which marked the end of the first year in Earth time he had spent in the cabin. Watching it happen, he was suddenly overwhelmed again by the enormity of his solitude, and it looked as if it were going to turn into another of those periods when he sat with a gun in his hand, sobbing and swearing in a violent muddle of self-pity and helpless fury. He decided to knock off the lamenting and get good and drunk instead, and he would make it a drunk to top all drunks on this happy anniversary night. But he hadn't done that either. He had everything set up, downright festively. Glasses, crushed ice, a formidable little squad of fresh bottles. But when he looked at the array, he suddenly felt sick in advance. Then there was a wave of leaden heaviness of complete fatigue. He hadn't had time to think of sealing the cabin. He had simply fallen into the bed, then and there, and for all practical purposes passed out on the spot. Barney Chard lay wondering about that. It had been, one might say, a rough year. Through the long days in particular, he had been doing his level best to obliterate his surroundings behind sustained fogs of alcoholism, the thought of the hellishly brilliant, far-off star around which this world circled, the awareness that only the roof and walls of the cabin were between himself and that blazing alien watcher, seemed entirely unbearable. The nights, after a while, were easier to take. They had their strangeness too, but the difference wasn't so great. He grew accustomed to the big green moon and developed almost an affection for the smaller one, which was butter yellow and on an orbit that made it a comparatively infrequent visitor in the sky over the valley. By night he began to leave the view window in operation, and finally even the door open for hours at a time. But he had never done it before when he wanted to go to sleep. Alcoholism, Barney decided, stirring uneasily on the sweat-soiled, wrinkled sheet, hadn't been much of a success. His body, or perhaps some resistant factor in his mind, let him go so far and no farther. When he exceeded the limit, he became suddenly and violently ill, and remembering the drunk periods wasn't pleasant. Barney charred that steel-tough lad, breaking up, going to pieces. Did not make a pretty picture. It was when he couldn't keep that picture from his mind that he most frequently had sat there with a gun, turning it slowly around in his hand. It had been a rather close thing at times. Perhaps he simply hated McAllen and the association too much to use the gun. Drunk or sober, he brooded endlessly over methods of destroying them. He had to be alive when they came back. Some while ago there had been a space of several days when he was hallucinating the event, when McAllen and the association seemed to be present, and he was arguing with them, threatening them, even pleading with them. He came out of that period deeply frightened by what he was doing. Since then, he hadn't been drinking as heavily. But this was the first time he'd gone to sleep without drinking at all. He sat up on the edge of the bed, found himself shaking a little again after that minor effort, but climbed to his feet anyway and walked unsteadily over to the door. He stood there looking out. The cloud layers always faded away during the night, gathered again at dawn. By now the sky was almost clear. A green glow over the desert to the left meant the larger moon was just below the horizon. The little yellow moon rode high in the sky above it. If they came up together, this would be the very bright part of the night, during which the birds and other animal life in the valley went about their pursuits as if it were daytime. He could hear bird chirpings now against the restless mutter of the little stream, which came down the center of the valley, starting at the lake at the right end and running out into stagnant and drying pools a short distance after it entered the desert. He discovered suddenly he had brought the gun along from the bed with him, and was holding it without having been in the least aware of the fact. Grinning twistedly at the old and pointless precaution, he shoved the gun into his trousers pocket, brought out matches, a crumpled pack of cigarettes, and began to smoke. Very considerate of them to see to it he wouldn't run out of minor conveniences, like leaving him liquor enough to drink himself to death on any time he felt like it during these 5 years, like leaving him the gun. From the association's standpoint, those things were up to him, of course, Barney thought bitterly. In either unfortunate event, he wouldn't be on their consciences. He felt a momentary spasm of the old hate, but a feeble one, hardly more than a brief wash of the early torrents of rage. Something had burned out of him these months, and increasing dullness was moving into its place. And just what, he thought startled, was he doing outside the cabin door now? He hadn't consciously decided to go that far. It must have been months, actually, since he had walked beyond the doorway at all. During the first few weeks, he had made 6 attempts to explore his surroundings by night, and learned quickly that he was confined to as much of the valley as he could see from the cabin. Beyond the ridges lay naked desert and naked mountain ranges, silent and terrifying in the moonlight. Barney glanced up and down the valley, undecided but not knowing quite what he was undecided about. He didn't feel like going back into the cabin, and just to stand here was boring. "Well," he said aloud sardonically, "it's a nice night for a walk, Brother Chard." Well, why not? It was bright enough to see by now if he kept away from the thickest growth of trees, and getting steadily brighter as the big moon moved up behind the distant desert rim. He'd walk till he got tired, then rest. By the time he got back to the cabin, he'd be ready to lie down and sleep off the curious mood that had taken hold of him. Barney started off up the valley, stepping carefully and uncertainly along the sloping, uneven ground. During the early weeks, he had found a thick loose-leaf binder in the back of one of the desk drawers. He thought it might have been left there intentionally. Its heading was, "Notes on the Terrestrial Ecological Base of the 18th System, Volume 3. After leafing through them once, it had been a while before Barney could bring himself to study the notes in more detail. He didn't, at that time, want to know too much about the situation he was in. He was still numb by it. But eventually, he went over the binder carefully. The various reports were unsigned, but appeared to have been compiled by at least 4 or 5 persons. Macallan among them. His writing style was not difficult to recognize. Leaving out much that was incomprehensible, or nearly so, Barney could still construe a fairly specific picture of the association project of which he was now an unscheduled and unwilling part. Selected plants and animals had been moved from Earth through the Macallan tube to a world consisting of sand, rock, and water, without detected traces of indigenous life in any form. At present, the ecological base was only in its 9th year, which meant that the larger trees in the valley had been nearly full-grown when brought here with the soil that was to nourish them. From any viewpoint, the planting of an oasis of life on the barren world had been a gigantic undertaking. But there were numerous indications that the Macallan tube was only one of the array of improbable devices the association had at its disposal for such tasks. A few cryptic paragraphs expressed the writer's satisfaction with the undetailed methods by which the base's localized climatic conditions were maintained. So far, even the equipment which kept the cabin in uninterrupted operation had eluded Barney's search. It and the other required machinery might be buried somewhere in the valley, or it might, he thought, have been set up just as easily some distance away. In the desert, or among the remotely towering mountain ranges. One thing he had learned from the binder was that Macallan had told the truth in saying no one could contact him from Earth before the full period of his exile was over. The reason had seemed appalling enough in itself. This world had moved to a point in its orbit where the radiance of its distant sun was thickening between it and Earth, growing too intense to be penetrated by the forces of the Macallan tube. Another 4 years would pass before the planet and the valley emerged gradually from behind that barrier again. He walked, rested, walked again. Now and then he was troubled by a burst of violent sweating, followed by shivering fits until his clothes began to dry again. The big moon edged presently over the ridge above him, and in the first flood of its light, the opposite slope of the valley took on the appearance of a fanciful sub-oceanic reef. The activity of the animal life about Barney increased promptly. It was no darker now than an evening hour on Earth, and his fellow occupants of the ecological base seemed well adjusted to the strange shifts of day and night to which they had been consigned. He pushed through a final thicket of shrubbery and found himself at the edge of the lake. Beyond the almost circular body of water, a towering wall of cliffs sealed the upper end of the valley. He had come almost a mile, and while a city mile at least, wouldn't have meant much to Barney Chard at one time, he felt quite exhausted now. He sat down at the edge of the water, and after a minute or two, bent forward and drank from it. It had the same cold, clear flavor as the water in the cabin. The surface of the water was unquiet. Soft, flying, large insects of some kind were swarming about, stippling the nearby stretch of the lake with their touch. And there were frequent, swift swirls as fish rose from beneath to take down the flyers. Presently one of them broke clear into the air, a big fish, thick-bodied and shining, looking as long as Barney's arm in the moonlight, and dropped back with a splash. Barney grinned twistedly. The notes indicated Dr. McAllen had taken some part in stocking the valley, and one could trust McAllen to see to it that the presence of his beloved game fish wasn't overlooked, even in so outlandish a project. He shifted position, became aware of the revolver in his pocket, and brought it out. A wave of dull anger surged slowly through him again. What they did with trees and animals was their own business, but what they had done to a human being... He scrambled suddenly to his feet, drew his arm back, and sent the gun flying far out over the lake. It spun through the moonlight, dipped, struck the surface with less of a splash than the fish had made, and was gone. Now why, Barney asked himself in amazement, did I do that? He considered it a moment, and then, for the first time in over a year, felt a brief touch of something not far from elation. He wasn't going to die here, no matter how politely the various invitations to do himself in had been extended by McAllen or the association. He was going to embarrass them by being alive and healthy when they came back to the valley 4 years from now. They wouldn't kill him then. They'd already shown they didn't have the guts to commit murder directly. They would have to take him back to Earth. And once he was there, it was going to be too bad for them. It didn't matter how closely they watched him. In the end, he would find or make the opportunity to expose them, pull down the whole lousy, conceited crew, see them buried under the shambles an outraged world would make of the secret association. The end of year 2. The end of year 2 on the ecological base in the 18th system arrived and went by without Barney's being immediately aware of the fact. Some 2 hours later he glanced at his wristwatch, pushed back the chair, got up from the desk, went over to the big grandfather clock to confirm his surmise. "Well, well, Brother Chard," he said aloud, "another anniversary and 3 of them to go. We're almost at the halfway mark." He snapped the cover plate back over the multiple clock faces and turned away. 3 more years on the ecological base was a gruesome stretch of time when you thought of it as a whole, which was precisely why he rarely let himself think of it as a whole nowadays. This last year, at any rate, Barney conceded to himself, had to be regarded as an improvement on the first. Well, he added irritably, and what wouldn't be? It hadn't been delightful. He'd frequently felt almost stupefied with boredom. But physically, at least, he was fit, considerably fitter, as a matter of fact, than he'd ever been in his life. Not very surprising, when he got too restless to be able to settle down to anything else, he was walking about the valley, moving along at his best clip, regardless of obstacles, until he was ready to drop to the ground wherever he was. Exertion ate up restlessness eventually, for a while. Selecting another tree to chop into firewood took the edge off the spasms of rage that tended to come up if he started thinking too long about that association of jerks somewhere beyond the sun. Brother Chard was putting on muscle all over, and after convincing himself at last, after all, the animals weren't getting hurt, that the glaring diamond of fire in the daytime sky couldn't really be harmful, he had also rapidly put on a Palm Beach tan. When his carefully rationed sleep periods eventually came around, he was more than ready for them and slept like a log. Otherwise, projects to beat boredom, and never mind how much sense they made in themselves, none of them did, but after the first month or 2 he had so much going that there was no question any more of not having something to do. 2 hours allotted to work out on the typewriter a critical evaluation of a chapter from one of McAllen's abstruse technical texts. If Barney's mood was sufficiently sour, the evaluation would be unprintable, but it wasn't being printed, and 2 hours had been disposed of. A day and a half, Earth Standard Time, to construct the operating dam across the stream. He was turning into an experienced landscape architect. The swimming pool in the floor of the valley beneath the cabin might not have been approved by Carstairs of California, but it was one project out of which he had drawn some realistic benefit. Then, half an hour to improve his knife-throwing technique. 15 minutes to get the blade of the kitchen knife straightened out afterwards. 2 hours to design a box trap for the capture of one of the fat gray squirrels that always hung about the cabin. 50 minutes on a new chess problem. Chess, Barney had discovered, wasn't as hairy as it looked. 5 hours to devise one more completely foolproof method of bringing about the eventual ruin of the association. That made no more practical sense than anything else he was doing, and couldn't until he knew a great deal more about McAllen's friends than he did now. But it was considerably more absorbing, say, than even chess. Brother Chard could beat boredom. He could probably beat another 3 years of boredom. But he hadn't forgiven anyone for making him do it. The end of year 5. For some hours the association's Altiplano station had been dark and almost deserted. Only the IMT transit lock between one of the sprawling ranch houses showed in the vague light spreading out of the big scanning plate in an upper wall section. The plate framed an unimpressive section of the galaxy, a blurred scattering of stars condensing toward the right, and somewhat left of center, a large misty red globe. John Emanuel Fredericks, seated by himself in one of the 2 tube operator chairs, ignored the plate. He was stooped slightly forwards, peering absorbedly through the eyepieces of the operator scanner before him. Melvin Sims, psychologist, strolled in presently through the transit lock's door, stopped behind Fredericks, remarked mildly, "Good evening, Doctor." Fredericks started and looked around. "Never heard you arrive, Mel. Where's Ollie?" "He and Spaulding dropped in at Spaulding's place in Vermont. They should be along in a few minutes." "Spaulding?" Fredericks repeated inquiringly. "Our revered president intends to observe the results of Ollie's experiment in person?" "He'll represent the board here," Sims said, "whereas I, as you may have guessed, represent the outraged psychology department." He nodded at the plate. "That the place?" "That's it. ET Base 18. Not very sharp in the tube, is it?" "No, still plenty of interfering radiation, but it's thinned out enough for contact. Reading 0.19 as of 30 minutes ago." Fredericks indicated the chair beside him. "Sit down if you want a better look." "Thanks." The psychologist settled himself in the chair, leaned forward and peered into the scanner. After a few seconds he remarked, "Not the most hospitable-looking place." Fredericks grunted. "Any of the ecologists will tell you 18's an unspoiled beauty. No problems there, except the ones we bring along ourselves." Sims grinned faintly. "Well, we're good at doing that, aren't we? Have you looked around for McAllen's subject yet?" "No, felt Ollie should be present when we find out what's happened. Incidentally, how did the meeting go?" "You weren't tuned in?" Sims asked, surprised. "No, too busy setting things up for contact." "Well," Sims sat back in his chair, "I may say it was a regular bear garden for a while, Doctor. Psychology expressed itself as being astounded, indignant, offended. In a word, they were hoppin' mad. I kept out of it, though I admit I was startled when McAllen informed me privately this morning of the 5-year project he's been conducting on the quiet. He was accused of crimes ranging, from the clandestine to the inhumane, and of course Ollie was giving it back as good as he got." "Of course. His arguments," Sim went on, pursing his lips reflectively, "were not without merit. That was recognized. Nobody enjoys the idea of euthanasia as a security device. Many of us feel, as I do, that it's still preferable to the degree of brainwashing required to produce significant alterations in a personality type of Chard's class. Ollie feels that too, Frederick said. The upshot of the original situation as he saw it was that Barney Chard had been a dead man from the moment he got on the association's trail, or a permanently deformed personality. Sims shook his head. Not the last. We wouldn't have considered attempting personality alteration in his case. Euthanasia, then, Frederick said. Chard was too intelligent to be thrown off the track, much too unscrupulous to be trusted under any circumstances. So Ollie reported him dead. The psychologist was silent for some seconds. The point might be this, he said suddenly. After my talk with McAllen this morning, I ran an extrapolation on the personality pattern defined for Chard 5 years ago on the basis of his background. Results indicate he went insane and suicided within a year. How reliable are those results? Frederick inquired absently. No more so than any other indication in individual psychology, but they represent a reasonable probability, and not a very pleasant one. Frederick said, Oliver wasn't unaware of that as a possible outcome. One reason he selected base 18 for the experiment was to make sure he couldn't interfere with the process once it had begun. His feeling after talking with Chard for some hours was that Chard was an over-condensed man. That's Oliver's own term, you understand. Chard obviously was intelligent, had a very strong survival drive. He had selected a good personal survival line to follow. Good, but very narrow. Actually, of course, he was a frightened man. He'd been running scared all his life, and he couldn't stop. Sims nodded. Base 18 stopped him. The things he'd been running from simply no longer existed. Ollie believed Chard would go into a panic when he realized it. The question was, what he'd do then? Survival now had a very different aspect. The only dangers threatening him were the ones inherent in the rigid personality structure he had maintained throughout his adult existence. Would he be intelligent enough to understand that? And would his survival urge, with every alternative absolutely barred to him for 5 years, be strong enough to overcome those dangers? And there, Sims said dryly, we have 2 rather large questions. He cleared his throat. The fact remains, however, that Oliver B. McAllen is a good practical psychologist, as he demonstrated at the meeting. I expected Ollie would score on the motions, Frederick said. How did that part of it come off? Not too badly. The first motion was passed unanimously, a vote of censure against Dr. McAllen. Fredericks looked thoughtful. His 17th, I believe. Yes, the fact was mentioned. McAllen admitted he could do no less than vote for this one himself. However, the next motion to receive a majority was, in effect, a generalized agreement that men with such, highly specialized skills as Barney Chard's, and with comparable intelligence, actually would be of great value as members of the association, if it turned out that they could be sufficiently relieved of their more flagrant antisocial tendencies. Considering the qualification, the psychology department could hardly avoid backing that motion. The same with the third one. In effect, again, that psychology is to make an unprejudiced study of the results of Dr. McAllen's experiment on base 18 and report the desirability of similar experiments when the personality of future subjects appears to warrant them. Well, Frederick said after a pause, as far as the association goes, Ollie got what he wanted. As usual. He hesitated. The other matter. We'll know that shortly. Sims turned his head to listen and added in a lowered voice, They're coming now. Dr. Stephen Spaulding said to Sims and Fredericks, Dr. McAllen agrees with me that the man we shall be looking for on base 18 may be dead. If this is indicated, we'll attempt to find some evidence of his death before normal ecological operations on 18 are resumed. Next, we may find him alive but no longer sane. Dr. Sims and I are both equipped with some drug guns which will then be used to render him insensible. The charge is sufficient to ensure he will not wake up again. In this circumstance, caution will be required, since he was left on the base with a loaded gun. Third, he may be alive and technically sane, but openly or covertly hostile to us. Spaulding glanced briefly at each of the others, then went on. It is because of this particular possibility that our contact group here has been very carefully selected. If such has been the result of Dr. McAllen's experiment, it will be our disagreeable duty to act as Chard's executioners. To add lifelong confinement or further psychological manipulation to the 5 solitary years Chard already has spent would be inexcusable. Dr. McAllen has told us he did not inform Chard of the actual reason he was being marooned. On the very good grounds, McAllen interrupted, that if Chard had been told at the outset what the purpose was, he would have preferred killing himself to allowing the purpose to be achieved. Any other human being was Chard's antagonist. It would have been impossible for him to comply with another man's announced intentions. Sims nodded. I'll go along on that point, Doctor. Spaulding resumed. It might be a rather immaterial point by now. In any event, Chard's information was that an important 5-year plan of the association made it necessary to restrict him for that length of time. We shall observe him closely. If the indications are that he would act against the association whenever he is given the opportunity, our line will be that the 5-year plan has been concluded and that he is, therefore, now to be released and will receive adequate compensation for his enforced seclusion. As soon as he is asleep, he will, of course, receive euthanasia, but up to that time, everything must be done to reassure him. He paused again, concluded. There is the final possibility that Dr. McAllen's action has had the results he was attempting to bring about. Ollie, you might speak on that yourself. McAllen shrugged. I've already presented my views. Essentially, it's a question of whether Barney Chard was capable of learning that he could live without competing destructively with other human beings. If he has grasped that, he should also be aware by now that Base 18 is presently one of the most interesting spots in the known universe. Sims asked, Do you expect he'll be grateful for what has occurred? Well, McAllen said judiciously, turning a little pale. That, of course, depends on whether he is still alive and sane. But if he has survived the 5 years, I do believe that he will not be dissatisfied with what has happened to him. However, he shrugged again. Let's get ahead with it. 5 years has been a long time to find out whether or not I've murdered a man. In the momentary silence that followed, he set himself in the chair Fredericks had vacated and glanced over at Sims. You stay seated, Mel, he said. You represent psychology here. Use your chair scanner. The plate's still showing no indications of clearing, John? No, said Fredericks. In another 2 hours, we might have a good picture there. Hardly before. McAllen said, We won't wait for it. Sims and I can determine through the scanners approximately what has been going on. He was silent a few seconds. Then the blurred red globe in the plate expanded swiftly, filled 2/3 of the view space, checked for a moment, then grew once more, finally stopped. McAllen said irritably, John, I'm afraid you'll have to take over. My hands don't seem steady enough to handle this properly. A minute or two passed. The big plate grew increasingly indistinct, all details lost in a muddy wash of orange-brown shades. Green intruded suddenly, then McAllen muttered, "Picking up the cabin now." There was a moment of silence. Then Fredericks cleared his throat. "So far so good, Oliver. We're looking into the cabin. Can't see your man yet, but someone's living here, eh, Sims?" "Obviously," the psychologist acknowledged. He hesitated. "And at a guess, it's no maniac. The place is in reasonably good order." "You say Chard isn't in the cabin?" Spaulding demanded. Frederick said, "Not unless he's deliberately concealing himself. The exit door is open." Well, the place isn't entirely deserted after all." "What do you mean?" asked Spaulding. "Couple of squirrels sitting in the window," Sims explained. "In the window inside the cabin?" "Yes," said Fredericks. "Either they strayed in while he was gone or he's keeping them as pets." "Now, should we start looking around outside for Chard?" "No," Spaulding decided. "The base is too big to attempt to cover at pinpoint focus. If he's living in the cabin and has simply gone out, he'll return within a few hours at the most. We'll wait and see what we can deduce from the way he behaves when he shows up." He turned to McAllen. "Ollie," he said, "I think you might allow yourself to relax just a little. This doesn't seem at all bad." McAllen grunted. "I don't know," he said. "You're overlooking one thing." "What's that?" "I told Chard when to expect us. Unless he's smashed the clock, he knows we're due today. If nothing's wrong, wouldn't he be waiting in the cabin for us?" Spaulding hesitated. "That is a point. He seems to be hiding out. May have prepared an ambush, for that matter. John?" "Yes," Frederick said. "Step the tube scope down as fine as it will go, and scan that cabin as if you were vacuuming it. There may be some indication." "He's already doing that," Sims interrupted. There was silence again for almost 2 minutes. Forefinger and thumb of Frederick's right hand moved with infinite care on a set of dials on the side of the scanner. Otherwise, neither he nor Sims stirred. "Ha ha!" Dr. John Fredericks cried suddenly. "Woo-ha! A message, Ollie! Your Mr. Chard has left you a message." For a moment, McAllen couldn't see clearly through the scanner. Fredericks was still laughing. Sims was saying in a rapid voice, "It's quite all right, Doctor, quite all right. Your man is sane, quite sane. In fact, you've made, one might guess, a 100% convert to the McAllen approach to life. Can't you see it?" "No!" gasped McAllen. He had a vague impression at the top of the desk in the main room of the cabin of something white. A white card, taped to it, of blurred printing on the card. "Nothing's getting that boy unduly excited anymore," Sim's voice went on beside him. "Not even the prospect of seeing visitors from Earth for the first time in 5 years. But he's letting you know it's perfectly all right to make yourself at home in his cabin until he gets back. Here, let me." He reached past McAllen, adjusted the scanner. The printing on the card swam suddenly into focus before McAllen's eyes. The message was terse, self-explanatory, to the point. "Gone fishing. Regards, B. Chard." There are universes unknown and unexplored, planets and strange life forms waiting to be discovered. The mysteries of time and space, a riddle yet to be solved. Join me next week for another exciting adventure on Astounding Stories of Space and Time.